Hey there, and welcome to this week's grammar video for Unit 3, Purple Listening. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the present unreal conditional. Let's get started. A few things you'll need to know to better understand this lesson is what are independent and dependent clauses. You'll also need to know what if clauses are, as well as cause and effect. It's also important to know what modal verbs are, specifically would, might, and could. If you don't know these things, that's all right. Take a moment to look them up and then come back. So in this lesson, we'll talk about forming the present unreal conditional. We'll talk about definite and possible results, as well as question structures for the present unreal conditional, as well as how to use the be verb in the present unreal conditional. In English, we use the present unreal conditional to talk about something that is unreal, impossible, or imagined. For example, if you exercised more often, you would be healthier. Or, she could be a famous doctor if she studied hard. In these examples, you can see there are two clauses, an independent clause and a dependent clause. For present unreal conditionals, the dependent clause starts with if. It's the unreal cause. In this clause, we must use a past tense verb, even though the sentence isn't in the past. For the independent clause, or the main clause, well, this is the effect or result if the unreal cause happened. The independent clause has a modal verb followed by a base verb. So keep in mind, the modal verbs are in the independent clause. We're going to use would, might, and could to form present unreal conditionals. If we have a definite result, we use the modal would or wouldn't. And for possible results, we use the modals might, might not, and could, but we don't use couldn't. To form questions using the present unreal conditional, you'll need to remember the question structures for each clause. In the independent or main clause, we use the question order structure. For example, we start with the modal, followed by the subject, and then the base verb. However, in the dependent clause, or the if clause, we use sentence order. This means we start with if, followed by the subject, and then the past tense verb. We'll use the modal will in questions about possible results. For example, if I studied more, would my grades improve? Would my grades improve if I studied more? If I went to Madrid, would I meet Ronaldo? Would I meet Ronaldo if I went to Madrid? It's also important to keep in mind that we can shift these clauses around. We can start with the dependent clause, or we can start with the independent clause. Looking at our examples, it's also important to remember that we can start with either the independent or the dependent clause to form questions. However, you'll need to keep in mind comma placement rules when we have two clauses. It's also important to remember that questions in American English don't use the modal might. And questions with could, they have a different meaning. These questions ask permission. For example, if I saved money, could I buy a car? Or could I buy a car if I saved money? Another really important thing to keep in mind when using the present unreal conditional is that the dependent clause, like the time clause, starts with if, and the verb is in the past tense. However, the independent clause, or the main clause, has a modal verb plus the base verb. When the main verb in the dependent or if clause is the be verb, you must always use were or weren't. This is for all subjects. This is really important to keep in mind. A few examples: if I were a doctor, I would be rich. I would be rich if I were a doctor. If she were nicer, she would have more friends. He wouldn't be so annoying if he were less talkative. If we weren't so smart, we might not understand grammar. You must also remember that the main verb in the independent clause comes after a modal, so it's always a base verb, or be. For example, If she were nicer, she would be the nicest person in the world. So just to recap, a few important points that you must remember when you use the present unreal conditional. The main clause or independent clause, we use modals, would, might, and could, followed by a base verb. However, in the dependent clause or the if clause, we have to use a past tense verb. Also keep in mind that for be verbs in the if clause, we use were for all subjects. Another thing to keep in mind is that you must pay attention to positives and negatives. For example, if I slept 9 hours every night, I blank tired in class. From the context of this sentence, we can figure out that we need the negative, so B would be the correct answer. Now, let's take a practice quiz. Pause the video and answer the following questions. Then press play so we can check your answers. Question 1. I wouldn't wake up all night if I blank a lot of water before bed. Looking at this sentence, we have the dependent or if clause, so we need a past tense verb. From context, we can figure out that we need the negative. To form a negative past tense verb, we need the helping verb didn't, so A is the correct answer. Question 2. If I didn't have 8 hours of homework to finish, I blank. Here we have the main clause, so we'll need a modal followed by the base verb. So A is the correct answer. Question 3. If he blank, he would buy a lot of really expensive cars. Unfortunately, he's poor. Here we have the if clause or the dependent clause, so we need the past tense. We're using the be verb, so we use were, and D is the correct answer. Question 4. You wouldn't feel so sick if you blank smoking. Here we have the dependent clause, so we need a past tense verb, and A is the correct answer. Question 5. If Jack ate healthier food, he blanks so unhealthy. Here we have the main clause, so we need a modal followed by the base verb, and from the context, we can figure out that it's negative, so C is the correct answer. That's it for this lesson. As always, I hope you thought it was useful. Class dismissed.